Hi, welcome to a discussion with Jamie Harrison. I'm Bruce Southworth, a book reviewer for Publishers Weekly and Drood Review of Mysteries. Jamie Harrison's first novel is a mystery called The Edge of the Crazies, published by Hyperion May of 1995. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, she had a varied career as a ghostwriter, a cookbook writer, manuscript reader, script reader, but she's also been a contributing editor to New York Times Sports Magazine, to Vanity Fair, and she worked for Rolling Stone for a period of time and was involved in the startup of Us magazine. Beginning in the late 1980s, she moved to Montana and worked for the Clark City Press as an editor. It's a small press there, where among the works she edited were those of her father, novelist and screenwriter Jim Harrison. Welcome, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we talk specifically about The Edge of the Crazies, I wanted to ask you, when you decided to turn to writing fiction, decided you wanted to do that, what made you decide to write a mystery?
It seemed like a practical choice, actually. I had a horror of really trying to write a classic first novel, which tends to be autobiographical. I just knew it wouldn't work. I really wanted to simply tell a story. And I read a lot of mysteries. I enjoyed reading them. It was sort of a practical choice.
That's just something then that you were particularly familiar with, not because the genre's kind of hot
I thought I could get away with it. It's probably the fair way to put it.
Okay. Was there a particular spark that you had in mind for this book? There's such a network of interesting people and plot, and is there any one thing that kind of set you on that?
Not really any one thing. Sort of observing the town I lived in. I'd been observing one particularly bad marriage among people I worked around, and somehow, somewhere along the line, I came up with the germ for certain characters in thinking about that.
Are a lot of the characters then are drawn on a variety of people?
They started out that way, and then they really veered far from, you know, originally, yes, in all fairness, they were, and finally the end result is nothing like the people who might have made me think up the ideas to begin with.
Many writers that I've had a chance to chat with have talked about the fact that the characters, as they are writing about them, kind of take over. They hear them, and when they're working in a word processor or whatever, they completely take over. Is that kind of what happens to you?
Yeah, they really did. That was so much fun, actually. Coming up with lives for people was probably the part I enjoyed the most, and they did take over. They changed a good deal, and I think that I also sort of began to feel that I was being cruel to my characters and tried to inject some humor because of that. I don't know what I had in mind. Writing a mystery, you know, per se, you're going to kill off people.
That's true.
I felt a little remorse at some point.
So you had to, kind of liven things up just a little bit, lighten things up a little bit. In the course of the mystery, one of the things I was particularly curious about is, let's take a step back here, because we're talking as though everybody out there knows exactly what's going on in this book, and that's not true necessarily. The story takes place in Blue Deer, Montana. A screenwriter, George Blackwater, is working on a plot or an outline for his next script, and all of a sudden he is shot and his computer monitor is shot out in front of him. And the sheriff, Jules Clement, begins this investigation into this, and as things go on in any good mystery, bodies start to mount up and things get more and more complicated. One of the things I was really curious about was how you decided to structure the book, in that in a lot of cases mysteries start out in a bang, yours does, but usually with a dead body very, very early on, as opposed to 100 or so pages into it.
Well,
was that conscious to do it that way?
It was, because I wanted it, because I'd really come up with the essential plot, who I wanted to kill, why I wanted to kill them. I had to keep George in the picture, but George is the person who sets Jules off on the wrong track, essentially. So I really had to do that, and I thought it would be kind of fun to do that, to have somebody survive something, an attack like that. It also meant that I could start with a little more humor instead of that grimness, and sort of mount up at some point as bodies keep appearing.
One of the things I was thinking that might have been a danger, something that you might have had to play with, is the first body that shows up. We won't go into too much depth. I don't want to give it away to anybody, but this one's mentioned on the jacket cover, so it's all right.
True.
Is George's wife, Mona, and by the time she actually does turn up, I mean, she's a pretty unsympathetic character, generally speaking. I mean,
You could say that, yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of reason not to like Mona. So again, when you were thinking that through, was that a danger you had to kind of worry about, saying, all right, now we're going to kill off this person, but she's been totally unpleasant, and who cares?
Well, I sort of thought that possibly she'd been glaringly obvious, just because she was such an unpleasant character. Oh no, maybe I finally didn't want to kill off people I liked. I do in the end. I don't really know how to respond to that. Killing off Mona, my big concern was that it doesn't really happen until later on in the book, and the conventions say you really need to have somebody deader than a doornail as early as possible. So I was hoping that I got away with it from the point of view it happens in chapter 5 or something. It's a big delay.
So it wasn't really an overt thing.
No.
You mentioned too that making up the lives of the characters was something that you very much enjoyed, and all of the characters have a very rich tapestry of their life presented. And did you go do like little bio sketches of each one of them, and then?
Not really. That wrote itself really fairly easily. I mean, I had to sort of make sure that people weren't too similar, but that part of it was easy, and that part of it was fun. It was really not wanting to say too much, especially about Jules, in that it probably will be part of a series. I didn't want to use up everything I had thought up about Jules in one book. I did little sketches. I mean, I had to keep track of what color people's hair was, how old they were. There were little practical things that got more and more confusing as I went along.
Yeah, well, especially with the number of characters that you had kind of going on. And an interesting network of people, too. It's all this sort of...
Well, everybody knows everybody.
Yeah, more literally and biblically, it seems.
Yeah, well, there was that biblical double meaning, yes.
Yeah, kind of interesting. Jules is an interesting character for a number of reasons, because he's not a traditional, he's the county sheriff. He's not traditional in that his, was it his father was the sheriff? His father, and son. But his training is in archaeology. He left Blue Deer when he was 17, 18, something like that, and went off. Why did you kind of particularly take that tack, to give him some distance? Or?
I wanted to give him some distance. He had to be a local boy. I had to give him an excuse for becoming a sheriff. He's not the likeliest candidate for law enforcement. He's a little bit left-wing. He's not anybody's idea of the usual deputy. But I wanted to give him distance. I wanted him to be local and yet not, to bring a different perspective to things, and to feel some awkwardness in asking awkward questions in town. So I did that part of it was clearly a device so that I could use a different voice than I would have if he'd been there his whole life.
And speaking of a different voice or a different perspective, it's kind of interesting that you, in these days anyway, in the mystery genre, that you chose to take the male point of view.
That actually was fun. That kind of freed me up a little bit. I think that there'd be a tendency, for one thing, it's a bit of a stretch. There are plenty of female deputies in Montana, female cops, but to have a female sheriff seemed awkward and seemed unlikely. And I really didn't want to spend a lot of time explaining such an unlikely occurrence. And finally, Jules gets to do more. It's just a fact of the world still out there that he has more access to things. Everything doesn't have to be about him being a woman. He's a man, he fits in. And it was fun to write. I got to write bar fights. I got to write all sorts of things.
Did it present an interesting situation as he was trying to both establish and patch up some of his love life?
Yeah, it did. And I just don't, sometimes I've never really understood people, men and women think differently, but they don't think that differently. I mean, a lot of Jules' past is probably closer to my past than anything else. I went to school in Ann Arbor. I did a lot of what he's done, and I've been through difficult things as he has. It wasn't really, I enjoyed writing that part of it. Everybody hit some period of confusion in their life, and he's just hit a few more than some people, I guess.
Oh. You did mention this. You referred to this quote. I wanted to ask you to explain this a little bit further. This was something from an interview said one time. I had a horror of writing a classic self-involved first novel. I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit more, what you meant by that.
When I first moved to Montana about 8 years ago, I thought I would write a book. And I sat down, and it really seemed that instead of living life, I'd just be examining. Things tend to be autobiographical. I didn't want to write a book about somebody's parquet floor. I didn't want to write a book about the life of the mind. I didn't want to feel self-pitying. I think that a lot of first novels are very, very self-absorbed, and I wanted to tell a story. And 8 years ago when I tried to write a novel, it simply didn't work. I also, because my father is a novelist, this sort of takes some of the pressure off the competition, frankly. To write a mystery, it's theoretically not serious fiction, and it is more fun. I could relax more while I was writing it.
Do you agree with that, out of curiosity? Whether mystery is a...
I think you can write very good novels that happen to be mystery. I don't know if I've written one, but I know that I've read wonderful novels that are typed as mysteries. So finally I thought I would write better if I was writing it under the guise of a mystery.
One thing I was also kind of curious about is, this may be an odd question, but why you chose to write it and have it come out under Jamie Harrison as opposed to your married name?
Because I keep switching back and forth. They're like aliases. Livingston's a small town. I took my married name in part because it's a small town. It's easier. It's your father's name. It's your husband's name. If you grow up with a fairly famous father, there's some relief in sort of being yourself under another name again. When I worked at Clark City Press, I was publishing my father and publishing a lot of writers. It's a very small company. I did everything from taking mail orders to everything else. And 1 out of 5 calls, somebody would say, "Are you Jim Harrison's daughter?" And I loved my father, but I finally just got sick of these conversations. I met him in 1980, and it was just so it was easier to be Jamie Potenberg.
Just to kind of separate
it's
yourself.
Nice to separate myself, and because why not? Finally. But nobody can pronounce it, so I went back to Harrison for this.
Well, that's probably as good a reason as any. In talking about your father a little bit, I'm curious as to, I'm sure he read the book in manuscript form. Now, you had worked on some of his works when you were editing at Clark City Press.
Yeah, I tend to read his manuscripts.
Did he kind of have joy at being able to, take on one of your works?
He had a few suggestions, and I think he felt some relief when he read it, and he liked it. I felt relief, he felt relief, everybody felt relief. He had a few suggestions. They were kind of minor. He would say probably that he's not a great critical reader in some ways. He likes to just read to enjoy, and I kind of inherited that. I actually, in some ways, hated editing, because I hate parsing things apart. If you read it, it must work. If you pull it apart, you start seeing faults, and you stop enjoying the experience. He had a few minor suggestions.
Nothing of major
really.
import?
No.
Did he give you any particular encouragement or discouragement as you were starting out on the...
He did encourage me. Clark City had essentially gone out of business, and writing, he suggested, and I knew was a way to be able to stay home more. I have a 5-year-old son, and be able to stay in a small town with not many job opportunities. In that way, Jules and I were sort of in the same boat. There's really not much to do. Your education really doesn't
buy you much.
There just aren't a lot of not even high-profile, well-paying jobs out there. So this was a way through.
Is that kind of that small town distance from other things one of the things that you think contributes maybe to the reason a number of writers and artists are kind of flocking to Montana? It seems to be just a haven these days for...
It does. Well, they can afford to. Because their source of income, they're not tied to it. They don't have to go in every day. I think they can just simply get there. They get to live outside of cities and don't have to show up at work at 9 every morning. And, friends bring other people out. There are a lot of people out there, and they're all fun.
Is it a fairly close-knit community, and even though it's still such a big...
Sure, but it's pretty relaxed. It's not, there's no college nearby, so it's not sort of an academic writers community. Missoula has a number of writers too, and they are in a sense more serious writers, I'd almost want to say, a little more tied into teaching. They've all taught up there. There's James Welch and Jim Crumley and Dick Hugo used to run the program up there. So it's a different sort of thing. A lot of the people in Livingston tend to be freelancers. There's Tim Cahill, who writes a lot of outside pieces. A really good novelist named Walter Kern. I don't know. People are pretty relaxed.
Must be a nice, refreshing kind of atmosphere that you don't have to worry about there's so-and-so on the street or something, too.
Yeah, you don't, and there's not a lot of reviewers around. I don't know. People tend to be sort of goofy and relaxed. No, but you know what I mean. I think it's a lot of people when they move from New York. In New York, if you're a writer, you need to go to signings, you need to go to cocktail parties. There's sort of a whole agenda that you kind of do need to follow, and there's not a whole lot of time to write or go fishing or do anything like this, so it's a very relaxed life to live in Livingston.
I was shifting gears a little bit again. I was curious when you were an editor, and now you had a manuscript that was being edited by someone. Was that an interesting transition?
Yes, it was. I was lucky, though, in that I had an editor who edited, who really, her name's Leslie Wells, and she used to work for a man named Sam Lawrence. She's a very talented editor, and she helped me out a lot. She made a couple of good suggestions, some good line editing. I did a lot of work on a rewrite at her suggestion. I think more than she actually intended, but I'm glad I did it. But initially, when I saw the manuscript come back in the mail covered with little tabs, I thought, this is the revenge of everybody I've edited before. There's people out there who would think this was very funny.
This is what it's like, huh?
Yeah, this is what it's like.
Do you have a number of people that you would take your manuscript to? You know, obviously your father or friends, other writers that like pass it out to 20 or 30 people and say, give me your thoughts.
I didn't pass it out to 20 or 30. I think I was too uncomfortable. I felt too awkward about it to do that. But my husband read it, and yeah, a couple of writer friends, a couple of people who'd grown up in the town I lived in, just sort of for authenticity's sake, in a way. If it went by them, a good friend whose family's always lived out there, who's a bartender and also did mail order at Clark City, people like that who were kind of a good judge of whether it read as a local.
You've hit that tone just exactly so. I understand that the next book that you're working on is called Going Local. Is that at least the working title?
Yeah, it is.
Can you give us a little bit of a flavor of what's coming up for Jules Clement in that?
Not so much plot-wise, but it's set in the summer, which is currently kind of a berserk season in beautiful southwestern Montana. It gets really crowded. It's rodeo season. We're 60 miles north of Yellowstone Park, so we get a lot of traffic. And there's a lot of wannabe cowboys running around. It's kind of crazy. About 15 years ago, there was actually a riot downtown in the bars after the rodeo was over, with, say, 20 people arrested. So it's kind of morbid behavior like that, possibly not as complicated for Jules personally.
Just sort of drunken rowdiness sort of stuff.
Kind of, and it has to do, it's one of the central characters is another native son who went away and came back.
There was a hint at the end of The Edge of the Crazies that one of Jules' old girlfriends was popping up again.
Oh, she would be comic relief.
And she's potentially going to be
She will be in it. Actually, this time around, if Jules has a love life at all, he unfortunately runs into a really bad woman. So we'll see. I'm sort of having fun with that.
I was going to say, there were a few in this book that weren't particularly good women. But
no, that's true. I don't really know why I came up with so many nasty characters. A lot of this next book will also have to do with mining, which is sort of a big question right now. It's not just to deal with it topically. There's a mine going in near Yellowstone Park, 2 miles away from it.
I think I've heard about that.
Yeah, which might leach into the park, and it's sort of a big mess. It's completely legal for it to go in, but it might be the first mine that doesn't go through simply because of sheer public opinion being against it. But it has to do with mining, and it has to do with a resort being built on national forest land, things like that. So a lot of kind of environmental questions this time around.
Interesting, interesting. Are you approaching the writing of it differently, the sit down and do it part of it differently than you did the first time?
Trying to be a little more organized this time, so that I don't have to rewrite as much.
Yeah. How do you normally write? So many people I know do X pages or X hours or
Well, because I have a 5-year-old, I really do it when I can do it. About 4 days a week, I work at night. I work on weekends and spare hours. Really, whenever I can, I make myself go sit down and hope that it'll be a good day. Yeah.
There's, I can't remember exactly which author I was talking to on one of these programs, as a matter of fact, who was complaining about people who said, oh, I'd really love to be a writer, but I don't have the time. When she wrote her first book in snatches of 15 minutes, you know, here and there and what have you.
I think there's a feeling that people forget that it's actually work. I mean, it really, at some point, it's just work. You might not feel like doing it that day, but you'll never get it done.
It also doesn't look like work, I think, to a lot of people who are outside it, you know, just sitting down and putting words down in a computer on paper.
Right.
It's not quite so, gee, that can't be that tough. Yeah, we wish.
Some days it is, some days it isn't.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of your, you know, varied career before you came out with The Edge of the Crazies a little bit. I'm kind of curious about when you were working for Rolling Stone in particular and starting up Us magazine. How much of an involvement did you have with that? I mean, what's it like to set up a major magazine?
Chaos. It's sort of fun. I used to cater before that. In a little way, it's like catering because it's sheer panic, you know, and very long hours, 70 or 80-hour weeks. I worked for Rolling Stone, if anything, for about a month because Us magazine was purchased right in there. But it was fun. It's sort of, I don't really read celebrity magazines anymore, so I don't know what I was doing there, and there was something kind of ludicrous about the whole thing to me. I interviewed a lot of starlets. I actually wrote the letters column for the first few issues because, of course, we didn't have any correspondence yet. It was fun. Starting columns, looking through other magazines for ideas. It was fun. I got tired of it eventually. But magazines are more interesting probably than working in book editing because everything at least goes quickly. And pressure can be kind of enthusing if you're 25. And after that, it's a little long.
You want to move back to Montana and just kind of relax for a
Run
little
for
bit.
your life, yeah.
I understand, too, that you did some ghost writing at one time. Is there anything you ghost wrote, if that's the word, that you can admit to or would admit to?
Oh, it was all sort of celebrity stuff, and a lot of it was sort of grim. Years ago in New York, a star's ex-wife was writing an expose, and that was fine. It was a good paying job, but at some point after I got out of the hospital for another drug overdose, I just quit. Everybody in New York does a lot of odd jobs, in a sense, and I did a lot of odd jobs until I got the magazine work.
It's interesting.
It was difficult, let's put it that way.
It was difficult. It must be a challenge to try and put the words down in a ghostwriting situation, put the words down and almost be in somebody else's head completely, unlike writing a fiction novel.
In a sense, it wasn't that hard. I don't... The emotional stuff around it was difficult. The person herself was difficult, but doing that was easy. It went pretty fast. I don't know. I never had trouble with that part of it. It was sort of fun. I'd run it by her, she'd double check it, make sure that I was fairly accurate.
And was that pretty much the one and only experience?
No, I've done a couple others.
Again, anybody you want to tell us about?
No, not really. Thanks.
Just, I had to ask.
I know.
Kind of
other actors and stuff like that.
I think it would be kind of fascinating to do that. I've always been intrigued by that, but I don't know. It would,
but I think finally biography, a life is a life, and the parts of it that you might find interesting, say if you were just meeting somebody and talking to them, are not necessarily what a publisher is going to want to read about. So it gets old fast. It's one thing to do a magazine profile, and that can be interesting. But a whole biography, it's just such a long, or autobiography, such a long process.
What kinds of things did you do as a consulting editor for?
See, that's sort of
is that fuzzy?
That's fuzzy. That's inaccurate. I actually worked for a man who was kind of a headhunter and consulting editor for all sorts of magazines: Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair. Right after Tina Brown bought it, a man named John Walsh, who now I think pretty much runs ESPN. But he also did books, like he packaged a book on the Heisman Trophy winners, so I wrote Heisman Trophy bios. I did point spreads for Inside Football. It was sort of fun to do in that you did a little bit of everything. It's, once again, living by the seats of your pants and just trying to I'm trying to think of a polite phrase for it, get through the creatively solve problems that you have absolutely no experience in. It was fun.
Well, I apologize for the inaccuracy. I
No,
took it directly out of your publicist's
No, the
bio.
publicist always wants to make it look more glorious than it was, and what it comes down to is a $5 an hour gopher job. It's the way a lot of people really start in New York, and it is fun.
So what kind of made you decide that you wanted to give up all of that insanity in New York and go back to Montana then, in the middle to late 80s?
I think that if you aren't really finally suited to live in a city, I lived in New York for 5 or 6 years, and I grew up in a small town. I wanted to go back to a small town, and I think by the time you make a comfortable living, you're burned out. And I'd been working as a script reader and editor, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd finally saved up enough money to escape, and so I escaped. I think that had always sort of been, I'd wanted to get a certain amount of experience, and finally I just didn't want to live there anymore. I liked Brooklyn. I like New York a lot. I think it's a wonderful city, but I just wasn't suited to stay there.
As a writer, you don't necessarily feel that need to be connected to the sort of the central machinery of the publishing
No, I mean,
world.
I grew up seeing writers who weren't connected to the central machinery. You can always visit. It's certainly easier. You have more money to visit if you live in a place like Livingston. It's easy to go. It's fun to go back. You get to see friends. You get to go to the parties. You get to eat at wonderful restaurants. But to do it day after day, writers I've known who've lived there have trouble getting work done. They have trouble enjoying life.
Just because of the pace and the things
The scheduling.
they have to do.
Yeah.
You mentioned one thing quickly, and I wanted to get it in just the last 30 seconds or so we've got. You did some script reading for Michael Douglas's production company. Was that kind of a fun thing to do?
Yeah, it was fun. I've read for in short jobs. I did some work for Zoetrope a long time ago, freelance stuff, and I read my father's scripts. I read a lot. It was interesting. It's very slow-paced again. You know, everybody knows that it's the likelihood of a screenplay making it to the screen is very small, and that was frustrating.
Yeah, you
but
saw
it was
a lot,
fun.
lot
Sure.
that didn't get there.
Yeah.
Well, we've run completely out of time. I don't know where it went so quickly. Jamie Harrison, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Edge of the Crazies is the book that's just out from Hyperion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.